And good morning. I'm Peter McLaughlin from Newtown, Connecticut. Today is Friday, June the 5th, 2015, and we're here in South Windsor, Connecticut at the home of Mr. Jim Dina, a primitive technology expert. And today we're going to look at how Native Americans planted and raised crops. So without further ado, let's get started.
Here we are in a Native American dwelling. They usually call them wigwams, many other names too. And it's early morning, very comfortable place to spend the night and maybe sleep in a little, but I just got awakened by a big racket outside. And I suppose I can't complain too much. It was one of the squaws pounding corn into cornmeal. That's going to be my breakfast, so I guess I'll have to put up with the noise and maybe go out and do a little work before breakfast is served. So, very comfortable place though. It's the dwelling is covered with various kinds of tree barks that grow near here, and in the winter we put a cattail mat on the door and keep the fire going in here, and it's a pretty comfortable place. It's time, I think, to get up though and see the outside world. Hi, I'm Jim Dina, and we're standing at a Native American dwelling site on near the floodplain of the Connecticut River. The floodplain's about a half a mile wide in this direction. We're above it on a little rise, and we have, of course, a Native American dwelling, a wigwam, covered with bark. It was traditional for the Algonquin tribes in this area. And behind it is something very important. It's the Native American garden, where we will grow our crops. And today we'll talk about how Native Americans planted their crops and grew them and harvested them for food. Here we are in the garden, and Native Americans planted many crops, but there were three that were especially important. And if you ask any school child today, they learn that Native Americans planted what is called a Three Sisters garden. And happily they study this these days, and they'll tell you that the eldest sister was corn. That was the most important crop. And the second crop was beans. And why those two crops? Well, they're both very good food crops, but there's a special relationship between them, and scientists call this symbiosis, and that's a big word. That just means the two crops help each other out. Now, the one problem with corn is that it uses so much nitrogen from the soil that it really depletes the soil from nitrogen, and it needs that to grow. Now, happily, the beans themselves take nitrogen out of the air and send it down to their own roots and put it in the soil. So the beans help the corn with nitrogen. The corn grows taller first, and then the beans have a nice bean pole to climb the corn. And I put these sticks in just as a safety measure. I'm not so sure Native Americans did this. If we have a cool spring season with lots of rain, the beans will grow very fast and they'll have a pole to climb up. If we have slightly drier, warmer weather, the corn will grow up first and the beans will have a bean pole. And sometimes we get a lot of wind off the Connecticut River meadows and the corn topples over, so I bring it back up and tie it here. So the sticks are an addition that I put in here. I'm not sure that Native Americans use them. So we have two crops helping each other out with the various chemicals that they need in the soil. There's a third crop here that's coming up. There's a leaf near my toe here. It's the squash plant, and everybody knows what squashes are. We eat eat them today also. And Native Americans had many kind of squashes. A pumpkin is a kind of squash. I'm not growing any pumpkins here today, but I have in the past. And another important one is a hollow squash called a gourd. In fact, getting kind of warm. And I think I'll take a drink out of my gourd. This is a gourd that was made into a canteen very conveniently. So some of the Native American crops actually provided tools as well as food. Now, I wondered at one point if the squash plants really contributed anything to the other plants in the garden other than growing squashes. It's not possible for me to water this garden by any means except rain. And if we get a dry season, this garden could die. But we have a plan to back that up down in the floodplain, which we'll talk about a little later. But when the squash plants mature, you'll see that all the squash vines run along between the corn hills and fill in all the spaces with these huge squash leaves. And they tend to keep the weeds down. And when it does rain, the rain washes off the squash leaves into the soil, and when the sun comes back out, the big leaves protect the soil from drying out. So the squash plants actually have an important relationship to the other plants too. Even though it's not chemical, it's got to do with water. By midsummer, the squash plants have really taken over if we have good growing conditions. And you can see that they filled all the spaces in between the corn hills. The corn and beans are still standing tall, and the squash's leaves are actually shading out some of the weeds. And of course, as we mentioned, when it rains, the water goes into the soil but doesn't dry out because of the squash leaves. So it almost looks like a cathedral spires of corn and beans surrounded by squash leaves. Water. Now, one of the problems with corn that I mentioned is that it depletes the soil, and modern agriculturists believe that the Native Americans had to move their gardens every perhaps 5 or 7 years. Well, I could move the garden back to another spot there and grow a lot of corn, but after I depleted the soil there, I would have to move my entire village. The wigwams would have to be moved because it was too far of a walk to get to the gardens. And back in the 1600s, when white settlers were first coming in, this was not a problem. I could move my village 5 miles away, maybe a mile away even, and to another village after that. 10 or so or 15 years later, when I came back to this fallow land, it would be plantable again because I hadn't planted. In the 1700s, however, there were a lot of white settlers in Connecticut, and by the time I got back to my first site, 10 or 15 years later, I would find an English farm here. And the English had cattle to fertilize their fields, so they didn't have to move them. So the need of corn to deplete the soil of nitrogen is actually one of the factors that dispossessed Native American people probably faster than anything else. Well, let's get down to some specifics and we can take a look at our nice new plants coming up. We only planted a short time ago, and already they're peaking up because we've had some good weather. Here, of course, is the big sister corn, coming up nicely. Right next to the corn are the beans. We've got a few more that will probably be coming up soon, and they're already returning some nitrogen to the soil to help the corn out. And here's a new squash plant, and someone is bitten a piece out of a leaf here, some insect or bird, who knows, but there should be more squash plants coming up here, and they'll catch up. Right? So this is the new garden, and I think we ought to take a look at what these crops are going to be like when they're ready for harvest. Now, it may sound like we're getting ahead of ourselves, but we're not the least bit, because we can't plant this garden without the crops from last year for seed. And here is some of last year's crop that, of course, we were careful to save. Right? Here's the big sister corn, and they had many kinds of corn, but this particular one was the most useful. It's called flint corn, and probably, that's a white man's name, but it was probably called that because the kernels are hard, just as flint is very hard. And wow, you can hear from the crunching, it's very difficult to eat these things in this form. Now, the beauty of this kind of corn was that It has a very low moisture content, and if you hang it up, it won't rot. The kind of sweet corn that we enjoy in midsummer has to be eaten quite quickly or it will rot. And I can picture it might have been quite a dilemma at the end of a hard winter where there was little game and you were running out of food, but you didn't dare eat those few last ears of corn because you needed them for next year's garden. So the preservation of flint corn is an important factor, and if you were going to use it for food, the squaws would put corn kernels in a corn pounding mortar like this and crush them into cornmeal. A few of them fly out, and this is the noise that the men usually heard in the morning while they were still sleeping. The squaws were outside pounding corn, and you couldn't complain too much because they were probably preparing your breakfast. And that's all it takes to smash up the corn. And here's another one of our useful squashes, as we mentioned, a gourd, and a shell to just scoop the cornmeal out. And so we have some pretty nice cornmeal there, and it's blue colored because the kernels are bluish colored. And a few more times around and we'd have enough for morning breakfast and a corn cake. Our second sister, the beans here, are quite beautiful looking. These are called cranberry beans. They're an heirloom bean from way back, and you could smash these up. They're high in protein, as all beans are, but I would use these in a stew that probably had some meat of various kinds, squirrels, doves, whatever the boys shot with their bows and arrows, or deer that I might shoot, and they would add a great flavor and nutrition. And they're in the pods, but we've cleaned most of them up for planting. And of course, the squashes, we know how to cook those. They could be baked underneath the fire or cut into smaller pieces and actually put in a stew also. All right, so these are our seeds for planting this particular garden, and they're beautiful looking crops. And here is another thing that was planted in the garden. This is Indian tobacco. It has a nice aroma, and tobacco is considered somewhat sacred by the Indians, probably because of its aroma. And they didn't smoke necessarily for recreation the way some modern people do. They often used it as a ceremonial thing. When men made an agreement, they would smoke, as some people often say, a peace pipe. But it was just a way of signifying that what they agreed to was sacred, and the tobacco was smoked to affirm that. And I often burn tobacco leaves in the wigwam for an aroma because I'm not a smoker. And there's a special place in the garden where we actually grow the tobacco. There's a little enclosure behind us over here, and the tobacco is not up yet, but it will be in that small enclosure, and it has its own place because of its sacred nature. So our upper garden is well underway. The crops are looking nice coming through the soil here, and it's time now to go down onto the floodplain and consider planting a second garden as insurance in case we have a very dry year and the rain doesn't keep this garden going nicely. So I got my tools and I've got my seed, and we'll go down below and see what that garden is like. We're actually standing on the Connecticut River's floodplain. The river's about a little over a quarter mile in that direction, and we're about 15 feet below the other garden that we've already planted. And in the spring, when snow melts in Vermont and New Hampshire, this garden is usually underwater. Sometimes it's only a few inches, sometimes it's up to your chest. We've canoed out here during those periods. Now, one of the advantages of that is the river silt settles in the soil as the water drops, and it adds nutrients. So this is usually a nutrient-rich garden. Solved that problem with corn. The biggest reason, though, for planting here is if we have a very dry year, this garden will prosper because it's almost on the floodplain. In fact, in the backdrop we can see cattails just another foot below this garden, and as we know, cattails grow in very wet soil. So as we were clearing this site, we also did something else that's kind of symbiotic. Again, that word of cooperation for us. We erected a temporary lodge over there from the little trees that we cut down. We used those poles, and we cleared cattails and other brush from this area to thatch it. So it was almost no work at all to get a temporary shelter down here that we can run into if we get a thunderstorm, and that has happened to me. All right, so let's get about tilling this garden here. I have my tools here, the hoe, which is just a piece of stone about the right shape that's tied onto a handle with rawhide. There's not much to making it. All right? And native peoples were clever. I think you could see that this was the trunk of a tree and this was a convenient angled branch. And I just chopped off part of the trunk and it made a kind of a T-handle for my hoe. There's the hoe, and my rake is simply a shed deer's antler, a rather large one, tied to a handle too with rawhide. And we'll use these two tools in just a minute. Now, I've actually turned several of these hills over. This one's kind of curious. Someone's been meddling with my hill, and I know who it is. It's a female snapping turtle who has come up just a week ago to lay her eggs, and she probably buried eggs under there. All right? Now, they're not likely to last very long because our friend the skunk has a fantastic nose at sniffing out turtle eggs, and he'll probably eat all the turtle eggs that are in here, or maybe he's already done that. So we're rid of most of the debris from last year. You may have noticed in our upper garden that we weren't too terribly fussy about weeds for several reasons. The weeds are behind the corn plants and our other garden plants right now, and when the squash come in, of course, they'll shade over the weeds. We talked about that, but we don't need the space